Bitter wind howled through shattered glass as Clara Hensley huddled in a forgotten Rust Belt railcar. Penniless and evicted after a brutal divorce, she simply wanted a place to survive the night. She never anticipated that this rotting steel shell held a staggering, century-old fortune waiting to be unearthed. Clara Hensley's life had evaporated in the span of exactly 72 hours. At 38, she had spent a decade building a life with Richard Croft, a prominent Chicago real estate developer. She had designed their home, hosted his investors, and signed the endless stacks of documents his lawyers pushed across mahogany tables. She had trusted him implicitly. That was her first and most catastrophic mistake. When the divorce proceedings began, Clara expected a fair division. Instead, she was introduced to a masterclass in financial annihilation. Richard's lead attorney, Harrison Tate, produced a labyrinth of shell companies, offshore trusts in the Cayman Islands, and a meticulously buried clause in a post-nuptial agreement Clara vaguely remembered signing while recovering from pneumonia. On paper, Richard was heavily in debt. In reality, he had systematically legally siphoned every dime of their shared wealth into untouchable corporate entities. The judge's final gavel strike echoed like a gunshot. Clara was left with no alimony, no house, and a mountain of legal fees she couldn't begin to pay. Her personal bank accounts were frozen due to investigative audits. When she called her closest friend, Sarah Jenkins, looking for a temporary couch to sleep on, the call went straight to voicemail. The society friends she had hosted for years vanished like smoke. With a single rolling suitcase and $42 to her name, Clara boarded a Greyhound bus heading east, hoping to seek refuge in her deceased grandmother's vacant house near Altoona, Pennsylvania. But fate had one final cruelty in store. Upon arriving in the economically depressed, gray-skied town, she found the property foreclosed and boarded up by the bank. It was mid-November. The Pennsylvania air was heavy with the promise of freezing rain, and the afternoon light was already dying. Clara walked away from the boarded-up house, her rolling suitcase clattering loudly against the cracked asphalt. She couldn't afford the cheapest motel off the highway. The homeless shelters in the adjacent county were full. For the first time in her life, Clara was staring into the abyss of absolute destitution. She walked for miles, numb to the biting cold, driven only by the primal instinct to find shelter before nightfall. The paved roads eventually gave way to gravel, and the gravel gave way to the overgrown, rusted tracks of the defunct Appalachian Western Rail Line. The industrial graveyard loomed ahead like a skeleton of America's past. Decaying brick warehouses stood choked by dead ivy, their windows shattered by decades of vandalism. Clara's boots crunched over rusted iron and broken glass. She dragged her suitcase through a gap in a sagging chain-link fence, the jagged wire tearing the sleeve of her only warm coat. Deep within the rail yard, hidden behind a fortress of overgrown bramble and collapsed corrugated roofing, sat a train car. It wasn't a standard freight car. Even beneath a thick layer of oxidized rust, moss, and graffiti, Clara could see the ghost of its former grandeur. It was a 1920s Pullman sleeper car. The faded peeling gold lettering on its side faintly spelled out the Midnight Sovereign. It looked as though it had been shunted onto this dead-end track half a century ago, and deliberately forgotten by the world. Desperation overriding her fear, Clara approached. The heavy iron door at the rear vestibule was ajar, permanently fused in place by decades of rust. She squeezed through the opening, dragging her suitcase behind her into the cavernous dark. The interior smelled of ancient mildew, dry rot, and cold dust. Clara clicked on her dying smartphone flashlight, the weak beam cutting through the gloom. Despite the water damage and the ruined upholstery, the bones of the car spoke of extreme luxury. Intricately carved mahogany paneling lined the walls. Tarnished brass sconces, shaped like blooming lilies, clung to the wood. The floor, though warped, was inlaid with intricate geometric patterns. Clara found a compartment near the back that seemed relatively untouched by the elements. A long, built-in bench seat still held the remnants of a velvet cushion, though the fabric was stiff with age. Exhausted to her marrow, Clara collapsed onto the dusty bench. She pulled every piece of clothing she owned out of her suitcase, layering sweaters over her coat, and wrapped her head in a scarf. As the temperature plummeted below freezing outside, Clara lay shivering in the dark. She thought of Richard, likely sitting by the marble fireplace in his Lake Forest mansion, swirling a glass of expensive bourbon, completely unbothered by her existence. The sheer injustice of it all burned in her chest, providing the only warmth she had. I am nothing, she thought, the despair threatening to swallow her whole. I have been erased. She closed her eyes, listening to the wind rattle the heavy steel frame of the Midnight Sovereign, praying she would simply wake up the next morning. Clara survived the night, though her body felt as if it had been beaten with hammers. Pale, anemic morning light filtered through the grime-caked windows, illuminating dancing motes of dust. Her breath plumed in the freezing air. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, sharp and demanding. She sat up, rubbing her stiff arms, and took stock of her grim reality. She was miles from town. She had no food, and her phone battery was dead. She needed money. Even a few dollars for a hot meal. Clara stood up and began pacing the length of the Pullman car, her eyes scanning the debris. She wasn't an antique stealer, but she knew the wealthy circles she used to run in. People paid exorbitant amounts for authentic Art Deco fixtures. If she could pry a few of the solid brass sconces off the walls or salvage an ornate bronze door handle, she might be able to pawn them at a scrapyard or antique shop in town. She opened her suitcase and rummaged through her toiletry bag, pulling out a heavy metal nail file, the only tool she possessed. Clara approached a brass light fixture mounted on an elaborate mahogany panel between two shattered windows. She wedged the thick end of the nail file behind the brass plate and pushed. The metal groaned, but the rusted screws refused to budge. Frustrated, she put her entire body weight against the file, pushing off the opposite wall with her boots. Suddenly, the file slipped. Clara pitched forward, her shoulder slamming hard into the mahogany panel beneath the fixture. Crack! It wasn't the sound of solid wood breaking. It was a sharp, hollow, mechanical snap. Clara stumbled back, rubbing her bruised shoulder. She stared at the wall. The entire rectangular panel of carved mahogany had shifted inward by about an inch. Frowning, Clara pressed her hands flat against the wood. It was bald and surprisingly heavy, but it wobbled. She ran her fingers along the ornate trim surrounding the panel. Unlike the other sections of the car, which were nailed or glued into place, this panel seemed to be fitted into a recessed track. Curiosity, sparked by the sheer boredom of survival, took over. Clara inserted her nail file into the gap between the trim and the shifted panel. She levered it backward. With a harsh screech of grinding metal tracks, the heavy wooden panel slid to the left, disappearing behind the adjacent wall. Clara gasped, stepping back. It wasn't just a wall cavity. It was a reinforced steel safe built directly into the skeleton of the train car, hidden behind the false wood paneling. The safe door was slightly ajar, its intricate combination dial rusted and broken from what looked like a violent impact decades ago, perhaps a crowbar or a bullet. Heart hammering against her ribs, Clara reached out. Her trembling fingers hooked around the thick steel edge of the safe door. She pulled. With a terrible groaning shriek that echoed through the empty rail yard, the heavy door swung open. A cloud of trapped, century-old air washed over her, smelling of leather, dried paper, and faint metallic tang. Inside the cavity sat 3 heavy, brass-bound leather lockboxes, stacked neatly on top of one another. Beside them rested a thick canvas mailbag, the fabric brittle and grey with age. Clara reached for the top lockbox. It was staggeringly heavy. She hauled it out and set it on the dusty velvet seat. The brass lock was heavily oxidized, but a hard strike with the heel of her heavy winter boot shattered the brittle metal mechanism. She threw open the lid. Clara stopped breathing. The box was filled to the brim with stacks of paper currency, but not the greenbacks Clara recognized. They were large, beautifully engraved notes. Gold certificates, $10,000 denominations, bound in rotting paper bands bearing the stamp of a Philadelphia bank from 1928. Beneath the stacks of bills were heavy velvet pouches. Clara untied one with shaking hands and tipped it over the velvet seat. A cascade of pristine, uncirculated silver coins poured out, catching the weak morning light. Morgan silver dollars. Dozens of them. But it was the items nestled at the bottom of the box that truly sent a shockwave through her system. Raw, uncut stones, diamonds, emeralds, and sapphires, looking like coarse glass pebbles, stored in heavy wax paper envelopes. "My God," Clara whispered to the empty train car. She frantically dragged out the second and third boxes. The second contained more gold certificates and heavy bars of solid silver stamped with serial numbers. But it was the third box that held the true treasure, though it looked the most mundane. Inside the final brass-bound box rested a thick, leather-bound ledger, its pages edged in faded gold leaf. Beside it was a stack of yellowed legal documents and property deeds sealed in protective vellum. Clara wiped the dust from her hands onto her jeans and carefully opened the ledger. The handwriting was elegant, sharp, and penned in fading black ink. The first page bore a name written in bold, confident strokes. Property of Arthur Pendleton. Clara recognized the name. Anyone who had taken a high school history class in the Midwest knew the name Arthur Pendleton. He was a notorious Prohibition-era railroad baron and bootlegger who had vanished without a trace in 1931. Rumors had always swirled that Pendleton had liquidated his empire into untraceable assets just before the federal government closed in, but the money was never found. Until now. Clara turned the fragile pages of the ledger. It was a meticulous accounting of bribes, smuggled shipments, and extortion. Pendleton had documented everything, but as Clara scanned a column of names under a section titled Chicago Acquisitions, 1929, her blood ran cold. The air in the freezing train car suddenly felt suffocating. There, written in Pendleton's unmistakable handwriting, was a series of massive payouts, real estate transfers, and blackmail notes. And next to them was a name that made Clara's vision blur. Elias Croft, Richard's grandfather. The patriarch of the Croft real estate empire. Clara's eyes darted across the text. According to Pendleton's meticulous notes, Elias Croft hadn't built his empire through shrewd investments as the family mythology claimed. Elias had been Pendleton's accountant. Elias had embezzled millions from Pendleton's illicit operations, using the stolen money to buy up Chicago real estate during the stock market crash. But the ledger revealed something even more explosive. Pendleton had caught him. The entry detailed how Pendleton had forced Elias Croft to sign over the deeds to the entire Croft property portfolio back to him, holding them as collateral in this very vault, intending to ruin the Croft family permanently. Pendleton was murdered a week later, his train car mysteriously lost in transit. Elias Croft kept his stolen empire, believing the evidence of his theft and the signed deeds had been destroyed. Clara sat in the freezing dust, clutching the ledger. She looked at the immense physical wealth surrounding her, the silver, the gems, the bearer bonds, worth tens of millions of dollars today. But the real treasure wasn't the gold. It was the stack of yellowed vellum deeds in the bottom of the box. Richard Croft's lawyers had stripped Clara of everything by using the law as a weapon. But sitting in the forgotten ruins of the Midnight Sovereign, Clara realized she now held the original, legally binding deeds to the foundation of the Croft Empire. The very buildings Richard's wealth relied upon technically belonged to the estate of Arthur Pendleton, and whoever held these bearer bonds and unfiled deeds controlled the narrative. Clara wasn't just wealthy anymore. She possessed the precise instrument needed to legally obliterate the man who had ruined her. A slow, dangerous smile crept across Clara's face, warming her in the freezing dawn. She carefully packed the ledger back into the leather box. It was time to hire a new lawyer. Clara knew that leaving the rail car was the most dangerous gamble of her life. If the wrong person stumbled upon the Midnight Sovereign while she was gone, her only leverage would vanish. Working with feverish, adrenaline-fueled precision, she pried up a section of the warped floorboards in the sleeping compartment, carefully lowering the 3 heavy brass-bound lockboxes into the dark cavity below. She piled rusted iron brackets and decaying velvet cushions over the loose boards to mask the hiding spot. She took only what she needed to survive the next 48 hours. 6 Morgan silver dollars, a handful of pristine 1928 gold certificates, and a single uncut sapphire wrapped in a piece of torn fabric. The hike back to Altoona felt different this time. The biting wind still tore at her clothes, but the crushing despair was gone, replaced by a cold, calculated fury. Clara walked straight into the first pawn shop she could find, an establishment named Fowler's Coins and Estate Jewelry, run by a skeptical man named Benjamin Fowler. When Clara placed 3 of the Morgan silver dollars on the glass counter, Fowler's eyes narrowed. He pulled out a jeweler's loupe, inspecting the mint marks. "These are uncirculated," Fowler murmured, his tone shifting from dismissive to intensely curious. "San Francisco Mint, 1893. "Where did you get these?" "An inheritance," Clara replied, her voice steady and completely void of emotion. "I need cash, now. What is your best offer for the 3? Fowler paid her $12,000 in $100 bills. It was likely a fraction of their auction value, but Clara didn't care. She had seed money. Within 3 hours, Clara had purchased a burner phone, a tailored wool trench coat, and a first-class Amtrak ticket to Philadelphia. She needed a lawyer, not just any lawyer, but a predator. Someone who thrived on dismantling corporate titans and had the resources to go to war against Richard Croft and his attack dog, Harrison Tate. Her research led her to Nathaniel Harrington, a senior partner at the ruthless corporate litigation firm Harrington, Shaw, and Davies. Nate Harrington was famous for his aggressive, scorched-earth tactics in high-stakes corporate espionage cases. Getting a meeting without an appointment was impossible, so Clara didn't ask for one. She walked into the gleaming glass lobby of the Philadelphia firm, placed an uncut 40-carat sapphire and a 1928 $10,000 gold certificate on the receptionist's desk, and simply said, "Tell Mr. Harrington I can hand him the keys to the Croft real estate empire. He has 3 minutes to invite me in." 2 minutes later, Clara was sitting in a corner office with sweeping views of the Philadelphia skyline. Nathaniel Harrington, a sharp-eyed man in his late 50s with a neatly trimmed grey beard, examined the gold certificate under a UV light before turning his attention to the uncut gem. "You have my attention, Miss Hensley," Harrington said, leaning back in his leather chair. But Richard Croft is a fortress. His assets are tied up in impenetrable Cayman trusts. Richard's wealth is a house of cards built on stolen land, Clara corrected calmly. She slid her phone across the desk. On the screen were high-resolution photographs she had taken of Arthur Pendleton's ledger and the signed, unfiled property deeds from Elias Croft. Harrington picked up the phone. As he swiped through the images, his posture shifted. He sat forward, his eyes darting across the legal jargon in the photographs. He was silent for a long time. "These are absolute quitclaim deeds," Harrington whispered, reverence in his voice. "Signed by Elias Croft, surrendering the foundational plots of his Chicago real estate to Arthur Pendleton. Because they were never filed, Croft kept building on land he legally surrendered." But Harrington looked up, playing devil's advocate. "Pendleton is dead. If we reveal this, the property defaults to Pendleton's estate, not you. The state of Illinois would likely seize it." "Then we buy the estate," Clara said. Harrington smiled. It was the smile of a shark smelling blood in the water. "Pendleton vanished in 1931. Finding his rightful heir will take a team of forensic genealogists. I'm paying you a retainer of $10,000 in cash today," Clara said, dropping a banded stack of Fowler's money on the desk. "I will pay you $3 million upon the successful transfer of the assets. Find the heir." It took Harrington's team 2 weeks. They traced Arthur Pendleton's bloodline through a labyrinth of illegitimate children and changed names, finally locating his sole living descendant, a 72-year-old retired middle school teacher named Margaret Higgins, living modestly in Dayton, Ohio. Margaret had absolutely no idea she was the great-granddaughter of a notorious prohibition baron. Clara and Harrington flew to Ohio. Sitting at Margaret's small kitchen table over cups of weak tea, Clara laid out a proposition. She explained that there was an inheritance tied up in a complicated legal battle, but offered Margaret an immediate, tax-free buyout of her ancestral rights. Margaret, who was struggling to pay for her husband's medical bills, stared in shock at the cashier's check Harrington placed on the table. It was for $5 million, funded by the quiet, private sale of a portion of Pendleton's diamonds through Harrington's connections in Antwerp. Margaret signed the transfer documents without hesitation. In a single stroke of a pen, Clara Hensley became the sole legal assignee of the Pendleton estate. She now owned the unfiled deeds. She owned the ledger. She owned the land beneath Richard Croft's empire. 6 months later. The grand ballroom of the Drake Hotel in Chicago was a sea of black tuxedos and glittering evening gowns. Richard Croft stood at the podium, basking in the flashbulbs of the local press. Tonight was the apex of his career. He was announcing the groundbreaking of Croft Pinnacle, a $3 billion luxury commercial high-rise in the heart of the downtown loop. Harrison Tate, Richard's sleazy attorney, stood near the front row, sipping a martini and looking thoroughly pleased with himself. They had successfully starved Clara out, finalizing the divorce weeks prior without paying her a single cent. As far as Richard was concerned, his ex-wife had vanished into the gutter where she belonged. "This city is built on legacy," Richard spoke smoothly into the microphone, flashing his $1 million smile. "My grandfather, Elias Croft, taught me that wealth is about foundation. It is about owning the earth beneath your feet." "I couldn't agree more, Richard." The voice echoed through the ballroom, amplified by the sudden silence of the crowd. The heavy mahogany doors at the back of the room swung open. Clara Hensley walked in. She was unrecognizable from the shivering, broken woman who had crawled into a rusted rail car in Pennsylvania. She wore a tailored crimson Carolina Herrera pantsuit that practically radiated power. Her hair was perfectly styled, and around her neck rested a stunning, custom-set necklace featuring a massive uncut blue sapphire. Flanking her were Nathaniel Harrington and 2 uniformed federal marshals. Whispers broke out across the room. Richard's smile faltered, his hands gripping the edges of the podium. Harrison Tate stepped forward, his face flushing red. "Security," Tate barked. "Ms. Hensley is trespassing. Have her removed immediately." "Actually, Mr. Tate, it is you who are trespassing," Nathaniel Harrington announced, his voice booming effortlessly across the room. He snapped his fingers, and a process server stepped out from behind him, walking straight up to the podium and slamming a massive stack of legal files directly onto Richard's notes. "Richard Croft," Harrington continued, holding up a piece of heavy vellum. "You are hereby served with an emergency federal injunction, a cease and desist order, and a quiet title eviction notice regarding all properties held by the Croft Holding Corporation." Richard stared at the papers, his face draining of color. "What is this garbage, Clara? You think you can crash my gala with fake lawsuits?" Clara walked slowly down the center aisle, the crowd parting for her like the Red Sea. She stopped a few feet from the podium, looking up at the man who had tried to erase her. "Not fake, Richard. Historical," Clara said, her voice icy and calm. "Your grandfather, Elias, was a thief. He embezzled from his boss, Arthur Pendleton, and was caught. In 1929, Elias signed absolute quit-claim deeds, transferring the ownership of every single plot of land the Croft Empire sits on back to Pendleton." Clara turned to the crowd, raising her voice. "The very land you plan to build the Croft Pinnacle upon does not belong to Richard Croft. It belongs to the Pendleton Trust, and as of last month, I am the sole owner and executor of the Pendleton Trust." The ballroom erupted into chaos. Reporters frantically began recording on their phones. Harrison Tate scrambled onto the stage, grabbing the documents and frantically scanning them. "This is impossible," Tate sputtered, sweat beading on his forehead. "These documents are nearly a century old. Statute of limitations does not apply to unfiled bearer deeds of stolen property, hidden in an active federal vault, which the train car legally was," Harrington interrupted flawlessly, having anticipated every defense. "Furthermore, the Securities and Exchange Commission, along with the IRS, have already verified the signatures. The bank that issued Richard's loans for this new high-rise requires clean collateral. Since Richard doesn't own the land, his collateral is fraudulent." Clara watched as the realization hit Richard. His offshore accounts, his Cayman trusts, his complex shell companies, none of it mattered. The foundation of his wealth wasn't money, it was the real estate, and Clara had just pulled the earth right out from under him. "You're ruined, Richard," Clara said, leaning in so only he could hear. "The banks will call in your loans by tomorrow morning. Your investors will flee. The IRS will audit you for generational fraud. You left me with nothing but a suitcase, Richard. Now you don't even have the dirt on your shoes." Richard's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The invincible titan of Chicago real estate looked small, pathetic, and utterly broken. Clara didn't wait for a response. She turned on her heel and walked out of the ballroom, the flashes of cameras illuminating her triumphant exit. The aftermath. The legal battle that followed was brief and entirely one-sided. The revelation of Elias Croft's fraud shattered the Croft empire. Richard's investors pulled their funding, triggering a cascade of loan defaults. To avoid federal prison for bank fraud, Richard was forced to liquidate his remaining personal assets, moving into a cramped one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city. Harrison Tate was disbarred for attempting to tamper with the historical deeds. Clara, on the other hand, established Midnight Sovereign Holdings. She selectively sold off the Pendleton gems and silver, amassing a liquid fortune of over $40 million. She didn't keep the Croft properties. Instead, She sold the land to a rival developer for a premium, using the funds to open a network of heavily funded, state-of-the-art women's shelters across the Midwest, ensuring no woman going through a brutal divorce would ever have to sleep in the freezing cold. As for the rusted 1920s Pullman sleeper car sitting in a forgotten Pennsylvania rail yard, Clara bought the plot of land it rested on. She had the car painstakingly restored to its former Art Deco glory, turning it into a private, mobile luxury suite. Sometimes, when the stress of running a massive philanthropic empire grew too heavy, Clara would retreat to the train car. She would sit on the restored velvet benches, surrounded by polished mahogany and gleaming brass, and raise a glass of expensive champagne to the empty room, toasting to Arthur Pendleton, the ghost who had given her a second chance at life. What an absolutely legendary tale of karma and revenge! Clara went from having $42 and a suitcase to completely destroying the man who tried to ruin her, all thanks to a forgotten piece of Prohibition history. If you loved this story of hidden treasures and ultimate payback, hit that like button, share this video with your friends who love a good plot twist, and subscribe to the channel for more incredible real-life dramas. See you next time.